I did not anticipate, was not looking for creating a job for myself in this. That I got asked for names of people to do different things. And I asked around, I put in names. I was never on the list, never on my list. I was quite happy being assistant secretary. I was going to finish up my government career. As it became apparent that Condi Rice was going to be the next secretary, Condi and I have been friends since the early 80s, that we were both deputies of programs in what is now the institute that you're in. And kind of working with her, being in kind of the kitchen cabinet as well, so that was pretty appealing. Building something, I'm too old for this shit, kind of thinking. I suppose in retrospect that I would be thought of as a candidate for three reasons. One was the INR dissent, that we were less wrong. So the optics, a response to the bad estimate was put in the dissenter, or somebody from the dissenting bureau. Another was INR, and INR's general reputation as buttressed by the SSCR and then later the WMD Commission report. And the third was I'd been around. I'd been in the INR front office for 11 years. And I'd been through a bunch of DCIs and directors of DIA and the like. It says, who's got the experience to do this? That you would have come up with my name on the list. I said no initially, in the informal before being persuaded that how can you not take an opportunity to lead the most extensive remaking of the national security establishment since 1947? How many people get that chance? And my initial was, I don't want that chance. That's a huge undertaking. That will take me further and further from my real interests, which are analysis. But it worked out.
Teresa Smetzer, CEO of Smetzer Associates and retired CIA executive. When Tom ran INR, I don't remember how, but my company got called in. I mean, their technical infrastructure was literally falling apart. And we had just deployed, when I was still in the agency, Retrievalware as part of the new analytic platform. I think it was Cirrus at the time. And that was pretty groundbreaking. The analysts hated it, which just killed us. Why? Because it was context search, not Boolean search. So you'd search 1 minute, and then you'd search 2 minutes later, and you'd get different results because it was contextual search, not Boolean, which is what they were used to. Anyway, it was wild success. It just had some growing pains. So I went down to state with a team of guys, and they literally had a bunch of word macros that they were using. I mean, I don't even know how the stuff functioned. They had a whiteboard in the conference room where they kept track of who was doing what article. And I think we were able to help them. The junior analyst that got assigned to me, which I was kind of thinking, okay, how's this going to work, was Rebecca Lee. And that's where I first met Rebecca. And when I realized how smart she was and capable, I was like, hallelujah. Yeah. Flash forward, and I like Tom a lot. I was like, ooh, he's not the right guy for that. He's too cautious. He's too tentative. He's too contemplative. Ooh. But with Mike, it was fine.
When does Mike Hayden mention Mike Wertheimer?
Tom Fingar again.
Pretty early in the process. That, if my memory is right, he gave me a phone call. And they had just stood up a little group under a retired admiral, Jim King, I guess it was, to help with staffing and assembling lists of people. But he suggested that I talk to this guy named Mike Wertheimer. He says he's really smart, and I think you'll like him. And I called Mike, I guess right away. No reason not to. I called him up, and both of us had a sense. We talked about this for him sometime afterwards. Yeah, I'm doing this because I told Hayden I would do it. I had no expectations other than I checked the box. And Mike answered my phone call because Hayden had told him to do it. I don't think he expected anything to come. And we probably had a 30 or 40-minute conversation that was much more around sort of philosophy of analysis and transformation rather than reform. That we needed more than check the box kind of compliance with the terms of the, and I don't remember the specifics of it, but by the end of the conversation, I said something in effect was, I have no idea what the hell I'm going to do with you, but I want you to come work for me, and we'll figure that the details. We'll figure this out. And he had recently left NSA. I think he'd started his own consulting operation. And I remember saying, as you think about this, remember, I'm giving you can't turn this down. I'm giving you a job that's going to cut your salary in half and double your commute time. How the hell can you say no to that? And to my everlasting gratitude, he thought about it a bit and decided to give it a shot.
Michael Wertheimer, Assistant Deputy Director and Chief Technology Officer for Analysis at the Office of the DNI. And he had apparently told Tom the same thing. He said, you need to talk to this Mike Wertheimer. Now, bear in mind, I knew the call was a formality. Hayden had set it up, and he told Tom, you're going to like this guy, and he told me, you're going to like that guy, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. But that aside, Tom and I got on a call, and I don't know, he very much reminded me of the boss I had at NSA that covered for me and I covered for him. We just seemed to have that same wavelength that I had back at NSA with that fabulous boss I talked to you about. And all I asked for Tom was, I said, I need some money that's mine to control, because if I have to beg everyone for money, I'm going to spend all my time fundraising. He said, yeah, I can do that. He gave that right up. And I said, well, let's get to work. It was about a 1-hour phone call, and they said, process him.
That's it.
That was it.
No panel, nothing. No application.
No application.
And everybody was that way.
No application. Just bring him back in, and that was that.
So how does that happen? In our bureaucracy as it is, the rules being what they are, all these things we say, hey, we've got to have, representation that is representative of America. At this time, was it just that special? We're in a crisis mode. We've got to find a way to get forward.
It was that way for the stand-up of the DNI. They had to get people on board quickly. They didn't even have an office. They were in the new executive office building and then a few doors down. And General Hayden was in this mode where we got to get this person, this person, this person, and this person quickly, because he wanted to stand up the office, the first 25, 30 people. And they were able to, there was no interview, just get me your SF-86 was it? I already had a clearance, which was great. And let's get that processing going before, I think the whole processing was just a couple of weeks.
Richard Immerman. I was Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analytic Integrity and Standards and the Ombudsman for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I had already been invited to serve as the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence. I was invited because I'd been recommended. I don't know how much it had to do with that I was one of the relatively few historians who did, but I was invited because I was a historian. And Tom Finger wanted a historian because of the overlap between our skill set, and that's what he wanted for an intelligence analyst, to be able to interrogate documents, to be able to recognize the difference between an argument and a quote-unquote fact. So I gave I didn't tell anybody that I had been invited to this. I gave the presidential address in June. I think I entered on duty in August. So I already knew that I was going, although I was still undergoing clearance, but I certainly didn't, introduce, hi, I am the president and I'm about to become an assistant deputy director. One, because at that point there was somewhat of a tension between academics and those who went into government. Although I have to say I never experienced that. It was at that point, only at that point, that I realized that unlike in academics, I wasn't being invited to apply. I was being offered the job. So they sort of skipped what I was used to, which is you go and you interview, and in academics you give a talk, you do whatever it is. I was being offered the job, so I went down. I met with everyone. I really enjoyed my interactions with them. This was probably, I'm going to say, May or June, early June. It was certainly before I gave my presidential address, which was at the end of June. And the reason that I know that is that, and then I met with Tom. We had lunch together. At that point, the Office of Director of National the headquarters was in, it was in the Defense Intelligence Agency, but Tom's office, his primary office, and that of the NIC, was the CIA. So I met everybody at CIA. That's where AIS's offices were. And I met everyone, and I enjoyed it, and I guess I must have said at that point, yeah, I accept.
Dr. Fingar, again.
And so John Keefe comes into the picture. How did he get introduced to you?
He was introduced as a political. He had been a staffer to Jane Harman on the House Intelligence Committee. And among the kind of boxes that I kind of knew, I don't know how I knew it, I don't remember anybody saying anything about it, but that we needed to demonstrate that we got it, the need for reform, attentive to concerns on the Hill. And John was on that list. I knew a little bit about him, not much, because he had been the special assistant to Joe Preer in Beijing. When I was Powell made me the Stuckey in the State Department to manage the EP3 incident. I reminded him that I had a day job, and as a perfectly capable acting assistant secretary of East Asia at the time. And the answer was, I don't know him. I know you. I trust you. You got this. But John, Joe picked him. I had respect for Joe. And the little bit I saw of his involvement in it, this guy's more than competent in here. And then when I met him, it was a similar. Clearly, his political instincts were better than mine. Clearly, he was going to be helpful in how do we present this stuff on the Hill to keep people out of our hair and off our backs on this. It was also, I didn't appreciate at the beginning, that, how do we do stuff within the community? It was John that my initial approach has been, we're building an institution here. We're building a program of positions so we've got to stress the authorities of the deputy DNI as we do it. And John's response, he says, that won't work. I go around and talk. Nobody knows what the hell a deputy DNI is. To the extent they think they know, they don't like it. Everybody knows who Tom Finger is. You've got a reputation. You've got to let us use your reputation. And that turned out to be, one part Finger was a familiar face, the ones that got it less wrong. But also, chair of the NIC. Nobody knew what the deputy DI was, but they knew what the chair of the NIC was. That had a long history of people more impressive than I am who had done it. And so John said, let us build on that kind of political savvy. And again, I didn't know what I was going to do with him. But I asked, and he accepted and said, we'll figure this thing out as we go along. To this day, every time I see Jane Harmon, for whom I have a lot of respect for her, and she always says nice things to me, about me, what we did. But every time she says, but I still hate you. And part of that is taking John.
I am John Keefe, and I was the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analytic Mission Management. Yeah, because I had been an operations analyst earlier in my career, I sort of more naturally aligned and had not yet worked in the intelligence community. I more naturally aligned with the analysis crowd than the collection crowd. Right. And so, Tom Finger and I actually share a connection back to Stanford University. We were both alumni, and so he saw that on my resume, and he's like, as he told me, well, the guy can't be that dumb. And so he invited me in for an interview. We sort of hit it off. He was looking for reform-minded people. He appreciated having somebody who had been on the Hill, where reform was the coin of the realm for that bill. And so he figured that would be a little bit of an ace in his sleeve to know what Congress's intent was. Tom had some very clear ideas about analytic tradecraft standards and having an ombudsman and sort of improving the types of products that were going to the president in particular, and in the national intelligence assessments that were done, for big issues where it's a community coordinated product.
Now we hear again from Michael Wertheimer.
And it wasn't very long that the processing went through, and we were located in the CIA headquarters building, just a few doors down from the director of CIA. And he gave me one day. On the first meeting, I didn't have to talk. He said, that's it. And we met every day. So I said, tomorrow you better have something to tell me. And it was great. From that point on, it was strap yourself in. I met in that first meeting under Tom's group there. I met John Keefe, who I don't have to introduce. The others, I won't use their names, but the head of the President's Daily Brief, the head of the National Intelligence Council. What a crew. I never heard of a national intelligence estimate. I was a collector, right? I didn't know anything about President's Daily Brief, and I got to see one. The whole thing was a blast. So then it took off.
Teresa Smetzer again.
Who was Andy Sherman?
Andy was Mike Wertheimer's deputy, so and Mike was the AD&I for analytic transformation, and Andy was his deputy. So it sounds a little bureaucratic, but I think you're tracking. He was Mike's deputy, more or less. And so Mike was from NSA and Andy was from CIA. They were trying to be sort of organizationally ecumenical and get different points of view and perspectives. But Andy was also a really good person.
Here's Mike again.
I had a deputy selected for me, and I will mention his name, Andy Shepard. Andy was coming from CIA and had been on the presidential panel, the 9/11 panel, that was recommending all kinds of changes. He was rolling off of that and was going to report in about a week's time, whatever process he was going through. I had nobody working for me. I jumped in. There were contractors around, and I had to sit down and start briefings, learning about what my job role was and talking to folks. But there really was very little plan of what I was. Tom didn't sit down with me and say, I want you to do A, B, and C. None of that. So I had to learn from my colleagues what were the most important things going on in the President's Daily Brief. What did the National Intelligence Council think were the priorities? John Keefe started the same time doing the priorities. He was setting up the priorities. And together we would start doing interviews around the community. I went to every three-letter agency that I could. What are you stuck on? What are you? If I could change one thing for you, what would it be? And most everyone was very, very accommodating. And I waited until Andy showed up to help me understand that CIA mindset, to let him guide me in that culture. And Andy was fabulous at that. So the first thing Andy and I did was, the mandate was to share. A mandate that created the DNI, it was the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, was to create intelligence sharing. And how would we do that in a way that was less an affront? Let's not poke CIA in the eye here. Let's find a way to work with them, if not work with them, work around them in a way that wasn't subterfuge, was clear, was transparent. So we began scoping out for ourselves the 4 big initiatives that our office did.
Now we hear again from Teresa Smetzer.
I don't know if you know this because I don't think you were involved. One of the things they contracted, and this was, I don't know how much of it was Andy and how much of it was from my company to do, was create a thing called Forum 2010. And so they used my office spaces, and they were kind of like this in those days because I was a small company. And they had us bring in experts from industry, from academia, from technology companies. And so Mike, largely, would frame 3 issues. We would go out and identify experts that we thought really had something in. And sometimes they had ideas. Tom Armour was helping me. He worked for me at the time. And then we'd have these whole afternoon, evening events where we'd have dinner brought in. And it was those conversations, I think, really helped to shape Mike's or affirm or refute Mike's strategy or thoughts about what we should do for transformation. And you could never do that today for a million reasons.
Michael Wertheimer again.
I felt I was a different person. I was not going to suffer the what I was calling the tyranny of the SME. And the SME stood for subject matter expert. There were people who said, I know my target better than you, and so forth. They don't communicate this way. They don't work this way. And then 2 months later, 70% of all reporting was from the way they said didn't exist. But one of the underlying concepts that Andy and I had was when you have expertise applied to a problem that requires that expertise, that you're gold. But when you're in a process of change, when you're confronted with something for which your current expertise doesn't explain it, why is this happening? How is this happening? Expertise turns out to be an anchor. It anchors you in thinking that make the problem fit your solution instead of making a new solution fit the problem. And the wisdom of the masses, the large crowd, tends to always be better on change. It just is. And we know that Clay Christensen and others had written extensively right around this time, the wisdom of crowds. And we took that to heart. The world was changing. This is what happened, what I described back in my former job, where I said we had a huge success by reconfiguring how we went after signals intelligence in the world, where we went from voice to other things. Where was the intelligence going to be? Well, this was the dawn of email and text messaging and gaming. And we found we had to look for people in different, this is on the collection side, well, how they go about doing their business, how they communicated, how they talked about what they did, where they went, was changing on the analysis side. And much of the lore, much of the, as a mathematician, we call the axioms, the things that didn't change, just turned out not to be axioms at all. So Andy and I crafted these 4 programs specifically to broaden the aperture of not only our collection, but of our creativity.
Now we hear again from John Keefe.
So this is what I really liked about working for Tom Finger. I think Tom picked the individuals around him because they were similarly reform-minded, and he figured that they could figure out what needed to happen. And so, for example, Steve Kaplan was the head of the PDB unit. Steve was a long-time experienced CIA analyst, and he knew how to run the PDB unit. And so there it was a matter of taking a bunch of tradecraft standards and make sure that the PDB is up to standard, and it's a community coordinated product. The community coordinated product was probably the big change. It was no longer so heavily CIA. At least that I think that was true while I was there. In the years since, I have not kept track of how these things have ebbed and flowed. But certainly my experience later experience at NSA said that NSA was much more of a participant in the President's Daily Brief construction than it had been in the past. Mm-hmm. Mike Wertheimer came in from the National Security Agency. He was there to bring a technology bent to what we were doing. And Tom had said, trying to figure out how to manage the community of analysts, of which there were 17 or 18,000 analysts in the community back then, spread across 16 different components. And Tom did not view it as his role to manage all of those, but the question was, how do you bring that entity together as a community and at least try to have a common perspective across these different components on what are intelligence gaps. That was a big thing. Intelligence analysis driving collection was one of the themes that we quickly settled on would matter. How are they using the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, which during my time at ODNI, I wound up inheriting from a different directorate within ODNI. Can analysts in the community find each other? Or if they have a need for expertise, can they go into some database and say, here, I need a linguist on pick your language, or I need somebody with an economics background that understands this. Can I go do a search and find them? And so that eventually became what was known as the Analytic Resources Catalog, which was the big database. It's shocking to me how, in retrospect, how controversial it was. Because there was this high degree of suspicion within the components that this just becomes the ticket to my analyst being stolen from me and moving over to a different agency, which I don't think actually ever happened. Maybe there's a few anecdotes where it did happen, but the idea that we should be able to look each other up and find each other, and if I need an expert, I have no idea who to go to. I at least ought to get a list of names and help me find these people.
Now we hear again from Tom Fingar.
So the things that Mike did, A-Space, Library of National Intellipedia, as the early was a CIA thing that we rehabilitated in there. I picked up from John Gannon, the ARC, Analytic Resources, so you can find people with expertise that wasn't dependent on the organization chart slot that they occupied. People knew things. Everybody in this damn community knows more about the last job they had than the one they're in now. That's just the way it works. And they didn't get stupid when they changed jobs. But they also didn't get smart when they changed jobs. So you work with people with what they know and who you know.
You have been listening to the podcast series From Tragedy to Transformation, Intelligence Reform After 9/11, sponsored by the Unredacted Podcast. The interviews you heard were conducted by me, Brian Drake. We would like to thank our many contributors to this series: Don Burke, Sean Dennehy, Margaret Dillard, Tom Fingar, Jeff Fowler, Nicole Gibson, Richard Immerman, John Keefe, Mark Lowenthal, Rebecca McGregor, Joan McIntyre, Carmen Medina, Louis Shepard, Teresa Smetzer, Mike Wertheimer, Sean Woltman, and Jesse Wilson. From Tragedy to Transformation was produced by Lindy Kaiser and Brian Drake with support from Sean Dennehy, Jim Clapper, and Chris Rasmussen. If you have any questions or comments about this series, please reach out to us at questions@unredactedpodcast.com. And thank you.